Good morning, everyone. I'm James Walsh, Head of Membership Engagement at the PLSA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this first session of the PLSA's first ever technology conference. Now, we're kicking off by talking about cybercrime and cyber risk and how pension schemes can protect themselves against it. It's no easy subject, but fortunately, we've got three excellent experts to guide us through it. So the way we'll run this is that first, we'll hear from Lucy Stone, who leads the pensions regulators' work in this area. Then we'll have a second presentation, which will be pre-recorded this time, by Jim G. Jim is National Head of Forensic Services at the advisory firm Crowe, and he also chairs PASA's Cybercrime and Fraud working groups. And I know Jim shares my views on the importance of talking about these technical issues in plain English that everyone can understand. So that's always very welcome. And then finally, we'll hear from our third speaker. That's going to be Vanessa Roberts, who is Scheme Secretary at the Nationwide Building Societies scheme. And she's going to talk about how they're handling these issues in practice. So that'll be great. Do remember, ladies and gentlemen, you can tweet about this session. It's hashtag PLSA Tech 20. And do type your questions as they occur to you into the Q&A box so I can put them to the speakers. So it's questions in the Q&A box, comments on what you've heard in the chat box, please. So let's start with a quick poll to get our mental juices flowing. And that, yes, it's on the screen already. So you can see the questions there. It's who is accountable for ensuring member data is safe from cyber risk in a pension scheme? Is it the trustees, the administrator, the head of IT, the sponsoring employer, or all of these? So let's see your answers. Click the one that you think is the right answer as to who is accountable. See that 50% have said that the answer is the trustees. And then there's just 4% for the administrator. No one voted for the head of IT or sponsoring employer. 46% of you said all of these. So it's nearly a tie between the trustees and all of these. So I'm going to pass over now to Lucy Stone from Regulator. She's going to tell us which is the correct answer and give her presentation as well. So Lucy, good morning and over to you.
Thank you very much, James. I have to say I'm absolutely thrilled to be the first speaker at the first Technology and Pensions Conference because I love technology and sadly I also love pensions. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about TPR and cyber and our perspective. First of all, just to put this in context, let's talk about pension schemes and technology. I think it's safe to say that we are overdue a technological revolution in pensions. We are far behind other financial services, which is a shame because there are tangible benefits for schemes, in particular around automation and reducing errors, but critically for savers, again, reducing errors, self-service, etc. But whenever you introduce a new technology, there are obviously new risks and it amplifies existing ones. So when we talk about cyber, we talk about cyber-enabled crimes and cyber-dependent ones. Cyber-enabled crimes are just doing old crimes, but facilitated by or being able to be done in a new way by cyber technology, whereas cyber-dependent crime is crime that wouldn't exist effectively without cyber. So let's talk practical examples. What have we heard about at the regulator in terms of pension schemes? So one example would be ransomware attacks. So this is where your data access to your data is blocked if you don't pay a ransom, typically Bitcoin. We've also heard of member data being stolen, sold on the dark web, and then that is used to facilitate other types of fraud, typically ID fraud. So that's a good example of a cyber-enabled crime. There's obviously traditional fraud where someone works their way into an organization, and if there aren't the right system controls in place, they just steal money. CEO fraud is on the rise. My favorite example of this is when a CEO and finance officer were sitting together in a board meeting, and the finance officer looked at the CEO and said, "Have you just sent me an email asking me to transfer lots of money to XYZ?" Obviously they hadn't. Website defacing, people don't necessarily think about, but there is a famous case in Belgium where a pension fund had their website replaced with, let's call it material of an adult's nature. And finally, good old data loss. Think, if you go back old school, think about leaving a USB stick on the train. So let's go to your question. Who is accountable? And trustees. Everyone on that list can be responsible, and you can work together to do to make sure that security, that data and assets are secure. But at the end of the day, trustees are accountable, and they cannot outsource that accountability. So let's talk a little bit about trustees and controls and what we expect. Now, trustees and scheme managers have a duty to have internal controls in place. And it probably helps to think of cyber controls as another type of internal control. You must assess and understand the risk. You must put controls in place, and you have to monitor how effective those controls are and report any incidents. And I'll talk a little bit about those footprints on that graph later. So this requirement to have internal controls complements the duties in data protection law, which are on trustees as the data controllers. But the cyber risk does feel different because it's constantly evolving and it is unfamiliar. People are familiar with risks around investments and funding, but not necessarily cyber, which is why we've put out specific guidance on cyber principles for trustees. But there's other guidance available, such as the one that PASA has just launched, which Jim will talk about later, and guidance by the IFOA and PRAG. So what's in our guidance? I'm not going to go through all this, but effectively the first thing is to assess the risk. What are your assets that are at risk? But also, who you are accountable as trustees, but whose role and responsibility is it in the day-to-day? What systems are you using? And this is why I'll come back to those footprints. We talk about the cyber footprint, and it's not just about assessing the vulnerability of your scheme, but also everything that touches in an electronic way upon your scheme. So, for example, assessing your administrators is the obvious one, but also interfaces with the employer and particularly the trustees themselves. And once you've assessed the risk, you need to manage the risk. Now, some of this is basic hygiene, so making sure you've got a firewall in place and data policies and password protection, but also critically looking forward and having an incident response plan for when things go wrong, because things will go wrong and you can prevent a lot of it through putting the right protocols, processes and systems in place, but things may still happen. And part of managing the risk is making sure that you are talking, you're making sure you've got your controls, but also any third-party suppliers and service providers also have good controls in place. And keep yourself updated. You want to hear of incidents that are happening. You want to keep yourself updated on what's happening out there. So another poll question, how familiar are you with your scheme's incident response plan? Are you very familiar? I know it well. Somewhat familiar, and I know where to find it. I know we have one, but I don't know what's in it, and we don't have one, or I don't know if we have one. So what I would say is that if you answered that you're somewhat familiar, or we have one but you don't know what's in it, you should get familiar. If you're a trustee, you are accountable and you want to know what's in your incident response plan, and you want to make sure it's fit for purpose. And if you don't have one, I would strongly consider getting one done. So let's talk about what we're seeing out there in practice at the moment and how the world is changing. It's safe to say there's an increased focus on cyber. In large schemes in particular, almost everyone has cyber on their risk register now, but that is not universal to the landscape. So smaller schemes typically may not have it. Similar for the presence of controls, in our research, we know that more and more schemes are putting in place controls consistently with our guidance, but there are still some gaps, especially at the small end of the scale. Now that, to an extent, is understandable because large schemes are likely to be a greater risk, partly because they hold more data. But it's about taking a proportionate approach. So those basic hygiene factors, such as having password protection or having a firewall in place, everyone should be doing. So do think that you should be doing something, even if it's not necessarily penetration testing every 2 weeks. One thing that's quite unique to cyber is that, and this is not just about pensions, it's everywhere, cybercrime isn't reported. People have concerns about reputational risk, and so they don't report it, and they also don't report it to us, presumably out of the concern that they might be in trouble. But what worries us more about not reporting is how much of that reflects that it's not being detected. Now, we ask in our research whether people have been the victims of cyber attacks, and it does concern us when people say no, because actually, does that mean they're not a target? Or does that mean they've got great controls? Or does it actually mean that their controls are so poor they're not detecting that cyber attacks have taken place? So don't take a report of there's been no cyber attacks as being a good thing. We know that within the value chain, trustees are paying a lot of attention to administrators, which is good if they are an obvious target because they hold member data, but actually think more widely. To use a corny seasonal joke, make a list and check it twice. So think actuaries, lawyers, and trustees themselves. You know, are confidential papers being sent to Gmail accounts? So look at the whole of your footprint. More and more people have incident response plans, but it's not universal. Again, it tends to be more typical at the large end of the scale. And so all this comes back to research and conversations we are having. And since then, the world has changed with COVID. In particular, a few trends are likely to impact your cyber risk, home working being one of them. But also people are accelerating their digital strategies, in particular administrators, kind of moving to more automation, moving to online services for members. And processes are being amended. So in particular around ID verification for members and sign-offs, including by trustees. Now, some of these, they're great, again, all for embracing technology, but they do also create risks. And if you haven't looked at your cyber risks since you've put some of these strategies and changes in place, you should look at it again. I'll finish with some key takeaways. Trustees are accountable. That cannot be outsourced. It's great to embrace technology, but do understand that it carries risks. When you're looking at your risk, look at the whole of the value chain, including yourselves. And think not if, but when. So think about preventing attacks from happening through taking those basic hygiene measures, but also preparing for if things go wrong. I always use the rather extreme example that if a nation state wants to hack you, they will. So things will happen, and how are you going to get over that, and how are you going to get back online safely? And finally, keep updated. You know, this is an evolving risk, and there is always information out there about what's happening. The National Cybersecurity Centre is one source, but also talk to each other. Talk to each other about what's happening to you, and so you can swap notes. And that's probably the only way we'll stay, if not ahead of the criminals, at least not too far behind. Thank you very much.
Great advice, great guidance there. Just one quick question before we move on to Jim's presentation. You stress the importance of reporting breaches and problems back to you at TPR. What will TPR's attitude then be? Because sometimes, you know, schemes and trustees are frightened they'll get their knuckles wrapped for being open and honest with you. So how will you approach that kind of situation?
Yeah, well, you know, we try and be, hopefully we are pragmatic and proportionate, and we do recognise that this is a complex risk and you're not always going to stay ahead of the game. At the end of the day, if a nation state wants to take you down, there's nothing you can do to prevent it. So what we do is we would take a case-by-case approach and try to understand, have you put in place controls that seemed reasonable? So if this is a complete failure of internal controls, you've done nothing about this, you've ignored, you've put your head in the sand the whole time, yes, we wouldn't be best pleased. But actually, if you've put controls that seem proportionate and an incident happened, then you know you have done what is reasonable as a trustee. But more importantly, it helps us understand what's out there and potentially stop the same issue from happening to other schemes as well. So we would encourage you to report. I mean, you already have to report to the Information Commissioner's office if it is a data breach under certain rules. Just think about whether you should be reporting to us as well.
Okay, Lucy, that all makes perfect sense. Thanks very much, and thanks for your presentation. So we're going to hear now from our second speaker, Jim G of Crowe. Jim has pre-recorded his presentation, but he'll be joining us a little later live for the Q&A, of course. So let's roll Jim's presentation.
My name is Jim G, and I'm chair of the Pensions Administrators Standards Association Cybercrime and Fraud Working Group. I'm also a partner and National Head of Forensic and Cybercrime Services for Crowe UK. As well as my job with Crowe, I'm also a visiting professor and chair of the Centre for Forensic and Cybercrime Studies at University of Portsmouth. I've worked in this area for more than 25 years, and before joining private practice, I was Chief Executive of the NHS Counter-Fraud Service, protecting the second largest organisation in the world against fraud, cybercrime, bribery and corruption. I chair the PASA Cybercrime and Fraud Working Group. Since joining the private sector, I've advised clients from private, public, pensions and charity sectors from 43 countries to date. What I want to cover today is a bit of an introduction and then talk about the relevance of cybercrime to administrators, the nature of cybercrime, its extent, the impact of cybercrime in the pensions sector, and then talk about the new cybercrime guidance from PASA for administrators. And finally, we'll talk about what pension schemes and administrators can do to protect themselves, and then I'd like to take any questions that you have. Cybercrime is a rapidly evolving, serious threat to any organisation, and really the facts speak for themselves. In 2019, 42% of all crime in the UK was cybercrime and fraud. But after COVID, that figure is now over 50%. Also in 2019, 46% of all businesses suffered cyber breaches, according to the government's statistics. And we have to understand that administrators are attractive targets to cyber criminals. And that's because partly the rich personal data, which they control and process, think about decades of personal and financial data relating to the beneficiary, but it's also about the crucial importance of continuing to pay pensions uninterrupted. So if there's any threat which might disrupt the payment of pensions, then there would be enormous pressure to pay the ransom. And any situation of that type is one that cyber criminals find very attractive. Cybercrime is also reflected in terms of the 158 cyber breaches reported to the Information Commissioner's Office, of which at least 43 relate to cybercrime since the introduction of the General Data Protection Regulation in July 2018. And those 43 incidents concerning cybercrime related to security, unauthorised access or phishing. So for all these reasons, it is vital that administrators protect themselves effectively. And that's why PASA has developed these standards. In the Cybercrime and Fraud Working Group, I'd like to thank my colleagues Gillian Baker from Hymans Robertson, Andy Cassin from Willis Towers Watson, Justin McClelland from Stevenson Harwood LLP, and Michael Walters from the Invensys Pension Scheme. The nature of cybercrime is that it's rapidly evolving and continuously changing. It's not like some other risks, which are relatively static and have long established controls in place to mitigate them. We need to adjust and evolve our defences to make sure they're focused on the latest manifestations of the problem. We also need to understand that cybercrime has increased in sophistication. It's been growing for some years, but it's also increased its sophistication. We need to understand who undertakes it. It's not teenagers hacking in their bedrooms, and mostly not state actors, but rather rapidly growing, highly profitable criminal businesses making business decisions, illegitimate business of course, but business decisions about who they attack and who it's most profitable to attack. They undertake market research, looking at prospective clients, organisations perhaps who would need to buy the kind of data that they have. They make business decisions about what organisations to target, which are the organisations where there is likely to be the greatest gain for the least resource. They often hack organisations and steal data too, without pre-existing clients, but rather to stock their criminal enterprises. And different teams within the cybercriminal organisation will focus on gathering different types of personal information. One looking at financial information, another looking at address and asset ownership, another one looking at employment and identity data. All of those things are then brought together in a package which can be sold to somebody who wishes to steal the identity of the individual concerned. Most recently, there is also evidence of cybercriminals starting to use artificial intelligence to analyse the most promising weaknesses to exploit. So it's not just something for good, which it certainly is, but it's something which is being misused by cybercriminals to make their attacks more effective. We also have the advent of cybercrime as a service, CAAS. That's developed where for a set series of tariffs or prices, cybercriminals will attack an organisation for a client. Before COVID, I think we were already aware in recent years of some real headlines around cybercrime. 2 presidential elections in the US and France where cybercrime was found to have an influence. We had the ransomware virus, WannaCry, in the UK and across the world, but in the UK it froze the systems of 61 UK hospitals and 70,000 computers across the NHS. But beneath those headlines, I think some of the less well-known events, cybercrime events, actually are equally, if not more, worrying. We had the Travelex currency exchange company actually hacked in several different countries on New Year's Eve 2019, and it took weeks to actually get their operations back on track. Car crime in 2002, 300,000 cars were stolen each year in the UK. That declined to just over 65,000 in 2013, but by 2018 it was then up above 113,000 again, and that's because of keyless entry cars. Cybercriminals literally hacking their way into cars. And then you think about remotely operated drones and potentially autonomous vehicles, and you start to understand where things might be going. Over the last summer, 3 banks had their second factor authentication codes actually hacked. You know, the code that you get sent, 6-digit code normally, when you want to authenticate that it's you and want to make a payment from your bank account. We also had cybercriminals taking GCSE coursework hostage and demanding a ransom for its return, and online medical equipment being hacked. We even had UK universities become a target, and that was more interesting than just there being another sector where cybercriminals had decided to attack particular organisations. In the case of UK universities, they were trying to steal research and data with which they could stock their criminal enterprises if people came to them wanting that kind of information. And they were undertaking market research. They were looking at organisations, companies, which had actually spent less on research and development than their competitors, because they might be likely clients for the stolen data and research. And also looking at countries that had spent less on military research and data than those around them. For a similar reason, they might become likely clients. So all of that was happening before the advent of COVID. But since COVID, we've had another big surge in cybercrime. We've had warnings from the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, Europol, the European Policing Agency in Europe, and the FBI Cybercrime Division in the United States. And what's been revealed is that when COVID happened and the lockdown took place, organised crime groups actually found that their drug manufacture and distribution operations were being disrupted. So they transferred some resources across to cybercrime, then realised it was more profitable than they had thought, and there's now been a permanent shift in focus towards cybercrime. And that's why, when we looked at the government's national crime statistics for England and Wales, which were released 2 weeks ago, we can see an 86% increase in cybercrime just in the additional 3 months of the 12-month period ending June 2020, up 86% from 876,000 to 1,610,000. And the fact that what happened in 1 quarter, the increase in 1 quarter, could shift the number of cybercrimes across 12 months, 4 quarters, by that much, indicates probably that the increase in cybercrime is much more than that revealed in that one quarter. So what's the impact of cybercrime in the pension sector? Well, 158 breaches were reported to the Information Commissioner's Office between July 2018 and July 2020. And that includes 43 which relate to cybercrime, 13 to phishing, 27 to security breaches, and 3 to unauthorised access. Indeed, a leading pensions administrator suffered a ransomware attack in the summer. Thankfully, they had adopted an approach which wasn't just to try and rely on technological protection, but was also about managing the attack if one were to happen, and also recovering and mitigating any damage. It's crucial to do all of those three things. In recent years, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the White House have all been hacked. So to imagine it's possible to have 100% protection is being unrealistic. We need to be as well protected as possible, but also able to manage an attack if it happens and to recover and mitigate the damage. Pension schemes typically hold and process large amounts of personal and sensitive data. That makes them a potentially attractive target for cybercriminals. We shouldn't forget that, and the number of data breaches, and specifically cybercrime data breaches, should remind us of that fact. So I'm really pleased that this guidance has been published. I'd like to thank the Cybercrime and Fraud Working Group that worked with me on this. The guidance covers developments in recent years. So what is cybercrime? Really talking about the nature of cybercrime, looking at particular cybercrime techniques and examples, looking at the role of the dark web, which is where many cybercrime attacks are planned, but focusing on two main areas. For administrators to understand their vulnerability to cybercrime. If you don't understand a problem, then your chances of putting in place the right solution are limited. And then ensuring that an administrator is resilient to cybercrime, that is, as well protected as possible, able to manage an attack if it happens, and to recover and mitigate any damage, so that that administrator can remain able to fulfill key functions. I think there are 5 key things to remember. First, cybercrime is not a static risk like other risks. Very important to remember. It's a rapidly evolving, continually mutating problem, pretty much like another virus we're having to deal with in a medical context now. It is also likely to continue to grow and evolve as it has done since COVID. There are rapidly growing, highly profitable cybercrime businesses. These are the people who do this, and we need to understand that, because then that gives us an insight into their approach and what makes them likely to target one organisation rather than another. We need independent validation, in my view, of the effectiveness of cybercrime protection, and that's in pension schemes, in administrators, and in third-party suppliers. We need independent validation as to the extent to which an organisation is properly protected or not. And administrators need to understand their vulnerabilities if they are to address them. So in conclusion, I would just say that cybercrime is a significant and growing problem. No one should expect to be immune, but you don't have to be a victim. And if you're cybercrime resilient, again, the 3 things you need to do: be as well protected as possible, be able to manage an attack if it happens, and be able to recover and mitigate any damage, then that gives you the best chance of not being a victim. There is no magic, perfect technological solution to this. It's about organisation and management as well. And that's exactly who this new guidance from PASA is aimed at.
Jim, thank you very much. Great material there, and thank you for flagging up that very helpful PASA guidance. I just want to ask you one quick question before we move on to Vanessa. That's come in from Derek Scott, one of our delegates. So Derek asks, what are the panel's views, or what's your view, Jim, on ethical hacking to test systems? And Derek says one of our scheme sponsors carries out fairly frequent checks and tests, reactions to scam emails, etc., which can be embarrassing for those who fail them. So ethical hacking, Jim.
Yes, or indeed sometimes called penetration testing. Yes, I mean, it's essential, and it's done regularly. Organisations often do this annually. I think probably with the current surge in cybercrime, it's worth doing it more frequently than that. One of the things that our penetration testers tell us is that, and this illustrates the rapidly evolving nature of the problem which I touched on in the presentation, they tell us if they actually stop doing what they're doing for more than 6 months, they can never get back into that work because the problem has evolved so much. And that's quite a scary thought, the rapidly growing, rapidly evolving nature of this particular problem. But penetration testing, and also linked to that, there's another similar service which identifies the vulnerabilities, but actually without exploiting them, internal vulnerability assessments. You can do that very easily and quite cheaply, effectively plugging a mini computer into the systems, and a report is generated which gives both those in managerial and governance positions an overall view of what the situation is in terms of vulnerabilities, but also provides the technical detail for whoever's managing your technology to be able to go away and remove those vulnerabilities.
Okay, thanks, Jim. That's good to hear. Okay, let's move quickly on to Vanessa Roberts. Vanessa's from Nationwide Building Society, and she's going to talk us through how they've been handling those issues at Nationwide. Vanessa, over to you.
Thanks, James. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me, no problems. So I'm going to talk about our journey, which really started with GDPR. Having started to look at the requirements for GDPR, it made us take a step back and think about information security as a whole. Over time, we've had really insightful presentations on cybersecurity from the society, but they can be very daunting. If you put aside the human interaction with data, then cyber becomes the big issue. I'm no cyber expert by any means, but I try and apply a practical perspective and then get the expert help. So we started a discovery journey, and on that we started to look at GDPR. We also looked at fund information, that being financial, the trustees' personal information, as well as corporate sensitive information. One of the things that we wanted to understand was how we, as a sponsor, could interact better. So we also have suppliers, sponsors, advisors, and everybody within that list provides cyber support. We have circa 80 suppliers, and we wanted to go out to them and talk to them, but we needed some outside help. So with that outside help, we actually developed an information security questionnaire. And on that, we looked at GDPR questions, but also looked at information. One of the questions that we covered in the information questionnaire was, does the organisation hold an externally verified accreditation in respect of information security and cyber risk management? And if not, were the key areas of the UK government-backed Cyber Essential Scheme covered? Could I get the next slide, please? So on this slide, it highlights just a few of the questions that we asked. So there were a number of different headings, and in total there were about 70 questions. And hopefully this gives you a bit of insight to the extent of the questions we asked. Having collated and analysed all that information, it allowed us to understand what our risks were and also what our tolerances were. Thankfully, there were no real issues for us. I think a big concern for me was how we communicated as a trustee board. Personal emails were used by those trustees that weren't employed by the society. We'd already moved to electronic papers, so we knew that that was secure in the portal. So we worked with the society to really understand how they engaged and dealt electronically with their non-exec directors. And through that process, we actually decided to actually issue corporate email addresses to all those trustees that weren't actually employed by the society. The other thing that we also did with all our suppliers, advisors and managers, we put in place an encrypted transmission link, and that allows us to feel more confident that there is that encryption and it's safer as we communicate with them. The other thing that we had in place was we'd appointed an internal auditor to the fund a few years ago, and we really wanted to help, and by using them to actually support our cyber journey. So over the last few years, we've done a number of audits looking at our sponsor, our key operating systems, and also our contingency plans. And they've been really, really helpful in helping the trustees understand where we are. The one area that I wanted to pull out was, as part of a large organisation, it's very difficult to understand how your footprint sits into that. So we have very robust cyber protocols within the society. They have great checks and balances, but there's not always a clear line of sight as to how our footprint within that is actually protected by all those checks and balances. So we have an in-house administration team, and we have the in-house administration sitting in the society's infrastructure. And it was really then key for us to understand that all those checks and balances were in place. So we carried out an exercise with the society where we actually documented our footprint through the whole of the society's network. And then we now have a document that we're able to demonstrate where all those good system practices actually impact on the infrastructure that we use. And it was a really great piece of work to do, and great that we can show it then to auditors. And also, if the worst was to happen, we've got that there to show that we've actually done a good piece of due diligence. We are also lucky that we are supported by the society, and if they're doing any particular risk management work around key suppliers and understanding where they are currently, we're able to go in on the back of that. Can I have the next slide, please? So I think really just to wrap it up, cyber is always front of mind with our trustees. It's key risk on their risk register, and the controls are regularly reviewed by both the board and at its committee level. Don't forget to document your protocols, and don't forget to test them. For me, I see it as an ongoing journey, as the slides demonstrates. It's about discovery of your current suppliers, but also your new suppliers. Bring in your auditors to actually do the checking and helping you understand where you are. Don't forget to document and then test. You know, make sure that you've got the appropriate pieces in your contingency planning. Okay, thank you.
Vanessa, thank you very much. And that's a fantastic summary. I think particularly that last slide there, just as a reminder for trustees, scheme managers of what they should be doing. I just want to ask you quickly, Vanessa, you know, so many of us are working at home now. What difference has that made? Are there sort of different things that you're doing to tackle sort of new aspects of cyber risk that might arise from the fact that we're all on these home networks?
Yeah, I mean, we were very lucky that we had quite robust with the society, so that we were able to just seamlessly move into it. I think one of the big areas that we've had is actually how do we look at getting documents signed, formal documents, because business doesn't stop. So, you know, we're not able to print from home, so using our advisors to do that. But also we've used now, rather than just applying PDF signatures onto documents, we've used DocuSign, so even signing minutes, signing paperwork, to actually give us that level of security, that there isn't just signatures ringing around that people can get hold of and use.
Thanks, Vanessa. And Jim G should be on the line as well. Jim, I wondered if you wanted to comment on the working from home issue and the new risk that generates. Jim, could you come in on that?
Yes, certainly. Well, certainly many remote working networks were set up at pace necessarily. And I think it's true to say that security wasn't built into them at the stage they were first created, because people had other priorities. And that's certainly one of two reasons why there's been such a surge in cybercrime. I spoke earlier in the presentation about a threefold increase since April, May and June post the first lockdown. And that's certainly one of the reasons. The other reason is that organised crime groups have really shifted their focus a little bit more towards cybercrime and away from drug manufacture and distribution. So in a way, you have a perfect storm. You have greater vulnerability, more weaknesses there. You also have people working from home, perhaps not working together in the same way as they would have done before, with each of us supporting each other and reminding one another about risks. And then thirdly, you have the shift in the pattern of work by organised crime groups. And I think those are probably the three main reasons that have resulted in what is unprecedented. Certainly in my lifetime, I can't think of another type of crime which has increased threefold in a single quarter.
Thanks, Jim. And I can see that there's a comment come in on the Q&A chat from Paul McGlone at Aon, replying to the discussion we're having about ethical hacking exercises. He said that Aon ran a phishing exercise across a large group of trustees across their clients last year, and 26% of trustees clicked on what was a fake link. It didn't embarrass them by naming names, but perhaps a rather concerning result. Now we're getting a bit tight for time, so I'm going to ask each of the three of you, and I know Lucy has come back on, which is great, just to remind us, what will be your one top tip for our delegates to take away in just a couple of sentences, if you could. Lucy, perhaps you could go first.
I would say don't hide your head in the sand. Go and look at the guidance available and take proportionate steps for your scheme to move forward. Yeah,
thanks. And Vanessa, your thoughts on that?
I think mine would be to make sure that you're engaging with all your suppliers and advisors, and particularly your sponsor, so that you really understand what they're meant to be helping you with and that they're doing their job as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good advice. Jim?
Yes, I would say just remember there are three clear things you need to do. It's not just the technology and being as well protected as you can be. You can't be 100% protected, but also make sure you're prepared, you're ready to manage an attack if it happens. Who gets together and works to what processes and protocols? And thirdly, be ready to actually have the specialist skills to identify what the vulnerability was that was exploited and to recover and mitigate damage.
Great. Well, that's fantastic advice. We could have spent a lot longer on this. There's so many issues, but I think you've packed a lot of good guidance for delegates into that 45 minutes. So thank you very much to all our panelists and speakers for your great presentations, and thanks for taking questions as well, even if some of it was a little bit worrying and sobering. So remember, ladies and gentlemen, please do rate this session. You can do that on the conference platform, and if you want to watch it again or recommend it to your colleagues, then it's going to be available on demand, on catch up for the next month or so, and you'll be receiving a link about that. Otherwise, thank you again, Lucy, Jim, and Vanessa, and to everyone else, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.